Saturday, June 14, 1982. 14:32 Eastern Daylight Time. Maple Drive, a quiet suburban street lined with mature oaks and modest residences, appeared ordinary in every sense. St. Mark's Community Hall, at the street's end, hosted a wedding reception, its parking lot partially filled with cars, leaving narrow lanes for delivery vehicles and guest traffic. Guests arrived in a steady flow, exchanging pleasantries and greetings, some carrying gifts, others adjusting attire or corralling children. Among them, one guest, later identified as the primary observer, noticed a subtle, seemingly incidental motion. A small folded envelope exchanged near the northern lot between two individuals, concealed in a coat pocket moments later. At the time, it drew no attention, catalogued mentally rather than acted upon, yet it would form a critical reference point for subsequent observation. Inside the hall, the scene was conventional. White folding chairs arranged in rows, a temporary wooden arch draped with tulle and floral ribbons, tables for the officiant and seating for family, and a scattering of flower arrangements. Catering staff moved methodically, trays of hors d'oeuvres in hand, while a photographer circled, capturing arrivals from multiple angles. The hall itself seemed unremarkable. Yet within the framework of procedural observation, each movement, pause, and interaction held potential significance. The observer, arriving at 13:45 Eastern Daylight Time, followed a habitual routine, parking in the northern lot, walking along the gravel path to the hall, noting positions of vehicles and pedestrian flow. They chose a seat on the right-hand side of the central aisle, near enough to observe the groom unobstructed, yet distant enough to avoid detection. A small notebook rested on the lap, initially for recording general ceremonial details, yet it became the primary instrument for methodical observation. Within the first hour, ordinary behaviors were noted. The groom adjusting a tie, the bride arranging flowers, children moving between adults, and guests exchanging casual gestures. These actions, logged in sequence and duration, initially seemed mundane, but established a behavioral baseline. By 1450, the observer had identified preliminary patterns in the groom's actions. Every 5 minutes, small, deliberate microactions were repeated, adjusting cufflinks, scanning the northern parking area, or moving subtly toward a side entrance. Each individual motion appeared trivial, but, when catalogued, formed a consistent rhythm. The observer began estimating distances, noting the groom traveled approximately 30 meters along the hall's perimeter with each excursion, returning promptly after 2 to 3 minutes. Such consistency suggested intentionality rather than casual fidgeting. Environmental awareness became an integral part of observation. A black sedan, parked approximately 120 meters northeast and partially obscured by maples, drew repeated attention. The groom's gaze frequently aligned with the vehicle, establishing a line of sight that recurred with each departure. Although initially the significance was unclear, these repeated visual correlations formed a critical part of the emerging procedural map. At 15:03 Eastern Daylight Time, the groom exited the hall for a 6-minute period, moving outside along the northern perimeter. His gestures were deliberate yet subtle, adjusting a glove, scanning Maple Drive, and reaching into an inner jacket pocket. A slight bulge suggested a small object, later confirmed as a microfilm container or envelope, handled with proficiency designed to minimize visibility. Each action was mentally catalogued by the observer. Exit and return times, distance traveled, posture, and environmental conditions were logged with precision. These repeated microactions established a record that would later form the backbone of federal investigation. Simultaneously, the observer recorded peripheral environmental factors. Guests moved in patterns predictable for weddings, children darting between tables, servers crossing the room at timed intervals, and a photographer pausing at strategic angles. 3 minor anomalies were noted: a child running repeatedly to the northern lot, a hall attendant near the black sedan at 14:55, and a brief halt in the photographer's path along the eastern aisle. While each seemed insignificant alone, collectively they were documented for correlation with the groom's movements. The observer's methodology remained detached and objective. Patterns were documented without interpretation, ensuring any later conclusions rested on verifiable fact rather than speculation. Over the next 20 minutes, repeated excursions by the groom were observed. Glances toward the black sedan, brief interactions with peripheral guests, and minor adjustments to clothing pockets. Each action, minor in isolation, when aggregated demonstrated a consistency and precision consistent with covert operational behavior. By 1520, the observer had constructed a preliminary operational map: exit points, duration of excursions, lines of sight toward vehicles, and subtle hand movements indicating concealment. Each repetition reinforced the likelihood that these behaviors were not incidental but intentional. The suburban environment, ordinarily mundane, provided natural cover, allowing the observer to maintain visual contact without drawing attention. Timing was critical. Excursions coincided with moments of low attention during the ceremony or music interludes, suggesting situational awareness and premeditation. Between 1525 and 1535, multiple repeated actions confirmed the emerging pattern. The groom approached the northern hedge line, briefly paused, and adjusted a pocket or jacket lapel. Observed peripheral individuals, guests or staff whose presence remained ambiguous. Maintained positions along the groom's path without direct engagement. Their repeated positioning suggested potential signaling or operational facilitation, though at this stage, identification was not possible. All occurrences were logged with exact timestamps and environmental conditions, emphasizing consistency in methodology. By 1540, these repeated microbehaviors were integrated into a mental timeline. The observer noted sequences: exit toward northern hedge, 1450 to 1453, minor movement near service alley, 1455 to 1458, extended exit with partial concealment, 1503 to 1509. The precise intervals, distances, and durations allowed predictive mapping of potential future movements. Each sequence was cross-referenced against environmental variables, pedestrian flow, guest density, and parked vehicle positions. This procedural approach enabled anticipation of subsequent behaviors with high probability. Observation extended beyond the groom. Environmental mapping included the black sedan's positioning, potential line-of-sight obstructions, and peripheral guests' repeated appearances. Each data point was logged to ensure that anomalies could later be assessed within a structured framework. Attention to detail emphasized slow, methodical accumulation of information, characteristic of Cold War surveillance methodology. The observer's focus remained on factual documentation rather than interpretation. Each hand gesture, glance, and micromovement was a discrete data point. Repetition and consistency were emphasized over conjecture. Environmental cues, timing of speeches, music interludes, and minor guest movement were integrated to contextualize each excursion. The observer's procedural notes ensured that any deviation from the established baseline would be accurately identifiable. By 1545, the ceremony drew attention elsewhere. Guests were engaged in formal seating, socializing, and photography, temporarily reducing their awareness of subtle movements. The observer's notebook contained detailed records, time-stamped microactions, environmental context, and peripheral anomalies. No direct evidence of clandestine activity had yet emerged, but patterns had been systematically established, forming the foundation for potential escalation. The observer had effectively turned a typical social event into a controlled observational field. Each recorded behavior, from hand concealment to line-of-sight glances toward vehicles, was preserved as procedural evidence. Environmental factors and temporal sequencing provided context, ensuring that subsequent anomalies could be interpreted with reference to an established baseline. By systematically documenting patterns before overt suspicion, the observer created the conditions necessary to identify behavior consistent with Cold War intelligence tradecraft in later stages of the investigation. Through meticulous observation, precise note-taking, and methodical environmental mapping, the foundation was laid for a procedural escalation of suspicion. Ordinary wedding routines, exits to the northern lot, minor gestures, and peripheral positioning were transformed into actionable data. This continuous accumulation of behavioral evidence ensured that any subsequent federal or investigative intervention would be grounded in observable fact rather than anecdotal assumption. By 1600 hours, the observer had completed the initial baseline documentation. Repeated excursions, minor concealment actions, peripheral movements, and environmental cues had all been logged with precision. While no overt illicit activity was visible, the structured behavioral patterns suggested the potential for clandestine operations, creating a procedural framework that would support escalation in subsequent stages of the investigation. Every element, time, distance, line of sight, and minor gesture, was preserved in anticipation of future observation, analysis, and potential federal involvement. By 1605 Eastern Daylight Time, the observer had shifted from baseline recording to focused attention on anomalies. The Groom's repeated excursions, previously cataloged as pattern establishment, began to reveal subtle irregularities. While each movement was brief and superficially social, the consistency of timing, directional choices, and hand gestures suggested deliberate concealment rather than casual behavior. The observer noted the intervals between excursions with exacting precision: 1450 to 1453, 1455 to 1458, 1503 to 1509, and now 1605 to 1611. Each interval corresponded to periods of minimal attention among guests, with music cues, conversation clusters, or movement of children providing natural cover. The repetition implied an operational rhythm beyond ordinary social interaction, though at this point no tangible evidence had emerged. The observer also began cross-referencing environmental cues with the Groom's movements. The black sedan parked northeast remained in position, but additional peripheral vehicles had begun to appear. A gray coupe along the eastern curb and a delivery van idle near the side entrance. Each vehicle was cataloged with spatial coordinates, line-of-sight considerations, and potential operational significance. The observer maintained mental notes on door positions, window angles, and reflective surfaces, recognizing that subtle environmental variations could provide signaling information or serve as dead-drop concealment locations. By 1612, the Groom executed a sequence of hand gestures along the hedge line bordering the northern lot. These included brief touches to inner pockets, adjustments to sleeve positioning, and glances toward the parked sedan. Each microaction, while minor individually, was consistent with professional concealment techniques employed in intelligence operations. The observer documented the gestures, timing, and body orientation in a continuous log, correlating these micro-movements with previously recorded patterns. The repetition, combined with a structured environmental awareness, initiated the first measurable level of suspicion. Over the following 30 minutes, the Groom engaged in multiple brief excursions with slight variations. At 1620, he approached a gap in the fence near the side alley, paused for 47 seconds, then returned. At 1627, a similar movement occurred, this time with a peripheral individual visible but not directly interacting. The observer noted minute cues, peripheral individuals' hand movements, shifts in weight, and a subtle glance back toward the Groom. Though these interactions were inconclusive, the temporal correlation with the Groom's movement reinforced the likelihood of intentional operational behavior. The observer began systematically mapping potential dead-drop points. Locations included the northern hedge line, side alley near the service entrance, and a small gap in the fencing by the black sedan. Measurements were approximate. Distances of 25 to 30 meters between observed locations, line-of-sight angles from the hall's main entrance, and relative positions of vehicles and pedestrian clusters. Each site was logged for repeatable patterns and potential future retrieval, emphasizing the observer's procedural mindset, recording facts without conjecture while preparing for escalation if anomalies persisted. By 1635, micro-pattern recognition had advanced. The observer noted the Groom repeatedly executing near-identical sequences: approach, subtle concealment gesture, pause, glance toward peripheral individual or vehicle, and return. Each repetition was logged with exact timing, spatial coordinates, and environmental notes. This systematic accumulation of data began forming a procedural basis for predictive observation, anticipating when and where subsequent movements might occur, and which environmental factors would influence the behavior. The observer's focus also shifted to peripheral individuals, whose repeated presence correlated with the groom's movements. Two guests, neither family nor staff, consistently appeared near potential dead drop sites. Observed behaviors included maintaining line of sight with the groom, brief hand adjustments, and periodic repositioning of jackets or bags that might conceal small objects. The observer recorded timestamps and positions of each individual, integrating these observations into a larger pattern map. Though no direct interaction with the groom occurred, repeated proximity suggested potential operational significance. Between 1640 and 1700 hours, several anomalies intensified. The black sedan's driver briefly exited the vehicle, circled the lot at a measured pace, and returned without interacting directly with the groom. At 1652, the groom approached a gap in the hedge, paused for 61 seconds, and executed a precise hand movement suggestive of placing or retrieving a small object. The observer recorded each detail: hand orientation, finger positioning, body stance, duration, and return path. These repeated observations established procedural consistency, enabling cross-correlation with environmental factors and peripheral cues. By 1705, the observer recognized a distinct escalation in operational complexity. The groom began combining two previously separate patterns: hedgeline hand concealment and alleyway pauses. The sequence suggested intentional layering of behavior, possibly to test surveillance detection or to coordinate with peripheral operatives. Temporal and spatial correlations were logged with precision: timestamps to the nearest second, estimated distances, and sightlines relative to vehicles and other individuals. Recognizing the potential significance, the observer implemented a systematic plan for continuous monitoring. This included fixed visual positions with minimal movement, mental mapping of escape and approach routes, and preparation to document potential physical evidence without direct interference. Each excursion by the groom was observed through a lens of operational hypothesis. Could these repeated movements constitute clandestine communication, dead drop placement, or signaling behavior consistent with professional intelligence protocols? Between 1710 and 1725, the groom engaged in multiple layered excursions. He paused near the northern hedge, briefly adjusted his jacket pocket, glanced toward a peripheral individual, and returned. Environmental conditions were logged: shadow angles, lighting, pedestrian density, and vehicle positions. The observer noted that each repetition occurred during periods of minimal attention, reinforcing the inference of intentionality. Micro-pattern recognition enabled predictive assessment. The observer anticipated subsequent locations and actions with increasing confidence, further validating the growing suspicion. By 1730, correlations between groom movements, environmental cues, and peripheral individuals were sufficiently consistent to elevate suspicion to procedural concern. Each recorded data point, time-stamped excursions, hand gestures, line-of-sight glances, vehicle positions, and peripheral presence, was integrated into a comprehensive mental map. Observational notes emphasized factual, verifiable elements, creating a foundation for potential reporting to federal authorities. The systematic approach ensured accuracy while maintaining objectivity, avoiding premature conclusions. From 1735 to 1750, repeated excursions reinforced the observer's preliminary hypothesis. The groom alternated between hedgeline pauses and alleyway movements, consistently returning to the reception hall without deviation from established timing patterns. Peripheral individuals adjusted positions slightly but maintained proximity. Vehicle movements were minimal yet deliberate. The black sedan remained in position, while a secondary vehicle arrived briefly near the eastern lot and departed without incident. All occurrences were meticulously logged with timestamps, durations, and spatial references. Between 1750 and 1800 hours, the observer documented the most precise pattern yet. The groom approached the hedge, executed a hand concealment gesture for 52 seconds, glanced toward a peripheral individual, and returned to the hall. The observer cross-referenced these microactions with prior excursions, identifying exact repetition of spatial alignment, hand orientation, and timing intervals. This cumulative data solidified procedural recognition of unusual operational behavior. By 1805, the observer had collected sufficient detailed observations to support escalation. The combination of repeated excursions, precise microgestures, consistent environmental awareness, and peripheral individual positioning indicated behavior beyond ordinary social activity. While no physical evidence had yet been directly acquired, the procedural map established an actionable framework for potential federal reporting. Throughout the observation period, the observer maintained a neutral, fact-based approach. All recorded events were cataloged without speculation or assumption of motive. Each time-stamped movement, hand gesture, and environmental cue was preserved for analytical correlation. The consistency of behavior, combined with environmental awareness, signaled a credible operational pattern. By the conclusion of the observation period, suspicion had escalated from subtle anomaly to structured operational concern, providing the foundation for subsequent investigative intervention. The observer's mental map included repeated hedgeline movements, alleyway pauses, peripheral individual locations, vehicle positioning, and precise timing intervals. Each element contributed to a procedural framework enabling predictive observation and potential evidence identification. The systematic accumulation of data exemplified Cold War surveillance methodology, slow, methodical, and reliant on repeated, verifiable patterns. By 1815, the observer had established a clear baseline of both routine and anomalous behavior. Each recorded excursion, microgesture, and environmental factor contributed to a continuous operational profile. While the wedding itself remained outwardly ordinary, within this framework it had become a controlled observation field, where subtle cues could reveal clandestine intent. The observer's disciplined procedural approach ensured that future escalation or federal involvement would be based entirely on verifiable fact, rather than assumption. On June 15, 1982, the observer's repeated documentation of anomalous behavior prompted initial consultation with local federal authorities specializing in counterintelligence. While the observer remained a civilian, the precision and consistency of time-stamped movements, hand gestures, and environmental interactions provided sufficient procedural basis for preliminary review. Federal agents initiated an investigative assessment, coordinating discrete surveillance with resources available for early-stage intelligence collection. Observation posts were assigned along Maple Drive, peripheral streets, and key ingress points to St. Mark's Community Hall. Each unit was instructed to maintain visual contact, record all movements with exact timestamps, and avoid confrontation or detection. By 8:10 Eastern Daylight Time, agents had established fixed posts overlooking previously identified hedge lines, side alleys, and the northern parking lot. Mobile units patrolled approach routes, maintaining distances of 50 to 70 meters to reduce detection, while preserving continuous line of sight. Coordination relied on secure radio communication, with observation logs maintained in real time for subsequent cross-reference. Each agent's role emphasized procedural documentation, time-stamped visual records, photographic capture of gestures, and environmental conditions including light levels, pedestrian density, and vehicle positioning. The groom, under continued observation, exhibited behavior consistent with prior patterns. At 8:23, he approached the northern hedge line, paused for 38 seconds, and executed a series of subtle hand adjustments indicative of concealment or retrieval of a small object. The observer, positioned within the fixed surveillance perimeter, corroborated the timing and gestures initially recorded during the wedding. Peripheral individuals maintained proximity but refrained from direct interaction, reinforcing the procedural nature of the operation. At 8:35, the groom departed toward the side alley for a duration of 5 minutes. Mobile surveillance units tracked the route, logging exact distances traveled and environmental variables. Observers noted the subtle alignment of vehicles, including the black sedan and a secondary gray coupe, with the groom's path. Each positional correlation was meticulously recorded, contributing to an emergent operational map designed to anticipate subsequent movements. By 9 o'clock, cumulative observations indicated the potential presence of concealed materials. The groom's repeated pauses, hand adjustments, and environmental awareness were consistent with known tradecraft techniques for object placement and retrieval. Federal analysts evaluated photographic documentation and real-time logs, identifying discrete anomalies correlating with spatially predictable locations. These preliminary findings were sufficient to authorize limited physical interception in a controlled and minimally invasive manner. At 9:12, federal agents positioned at a predetermined observational point intercepted a small, unmarked envelope previously noted during the wedding. Retrieval followed strict chain-of-custody protocols. Photographic documentation preceded physical handling, environmental conditions were logged, and the envelope was transferred to a tamper-evident container. All steps were meticulously recorded to maintain procedural integrity and evidentiary validity. This action marked the initial successful acquisition of physical evidence, confirming the presence of operationally significant material. Following the interception, the groom continued observable excursions. From 9:30 to 9:45, he executed movements toward the northern hedge and side alley in a near-identical pattern as previously documented. Observers noted subtle adjustments to sleeve and pocket placement, consistent with concealment behavior. Peripheral individuals maintained positions along the path, their movements repeated but non-confrontational. Federal analysts logged each action with exact timing, orientation, and environmental notes, ensuring that every microaction could be cross-referenced with both prior and subsequent surveillance data. Physical evidence, including the intercepted envelope and ancillary notes discovered within the envelope, was transported to a secure federal facility for immediate examination. Analysts conducted a procedural review, cataloging each item, photographing contents without altering physical configuration, and documenting environmental conditions under which the items were recovered. This process established baseline intelligence for further procedural intervention and informed subsequent operational strategy. During the following hour, federal agents continued systematic surveillance of both the groom and associated peripheral individuals. Observers maintained fixed positions, noting the precise alignment of bodies, hands, and gaze with respect to vehicles, hedges, and alleyways. Observational data was continuously time-stamped, including micro-adjustments of clothing, the orientation of gestures, and duration of pauses. Analysts emphasized factual correlation between repeated behavior and potential operational intent, ensuring conclusions rested on evidence rather than interpretation. By 10:15, an operational pattern emerged demonstrating repeated excursions coinciding with low attention periods among potential bystanders. These intervals allowed for placement or retrieval of sensitive materials without detection. Analysts compiled data for temporal correlation, each exit and return by the groom, the presence of peripheral individuals, and the positioning of vehicles along mapped routes. This procedural mapping created predictive models for potential future behavior and informed subsequent federal strategy. At 10:30, a secondary intercept was executed. Agents observed the groom reaching a previously identified dead drop location near the side alley. Utilizing established procedural safeguards, a small microfilm container was retrieved from concealment. Photographic documentation captured hand position, body orientation, and environmental context prior to removal. Chain of custody was maintained through sequential handling logs, ensuring evidentiary integrity for potential prosecution. This marked a critical escalation in operational confidence. Tangible evidence of intelligence activity had been acquired and properly documented. Federal agents also noted the presence of peripheral individuals who appeared to serve as indirect observers or signalers. Their positioning, timing, and repeated alignment with the groom's movements suggested operational coordination without direct interaction. Analysts incorporated these patterns into the larger surveillance framework, assigning probability indices to potential roles, including courier, spotter, or communication intermediary. All observations were logged in chronological order with exact spatial mapping, enabling subsequent predictive modeling of behavior. By 11 o'clock, cumulative data confirmed repeated operational patterns. hedge line pauses, alleyway excursions, peripheral positioning, and vehicle alignment consistent with professional intelligence tradecraft. Analysts integrated physical evidence, photographic documentation, and micro-pattern recognition into a centralized operational dossier. Each entry was cross-referenced with prior wedding observations, establishing continuity and procedural validation. Interviews with the observer were conducted to verify timelines and clarify previously noted anomalies. The civilian's notes were precise, with each time-stamped observation matching federal surveillance data. The observer's methodical documentation provided corroborative evidence, allowing analysts to triangulate movement patterns, environmental context, and potential operational intent. These procedural cross-checks reinforced confidence in the evolving operational profile. By 11:30, the groom had returned to the hall and maintained social interaction for an extended period. Federal agents utilized this time to analyze recovered materials, update surveillance logs, and prepare for continued observation. Each microfilm container envelope and ancillary note was examined for structural, physical, and procedural indicators, fold patterns, concealment techniques, and potential encoded instructions. Analysts remained focused on factual evaluation, ensuring conclusions were based solely on verifiable evidence. Throughout the mid-morning, federal intervention remained procedural and non-confrontational. Surveillance units maintained continuous coverage while minimizing exposure. Environmental conditions, including pedestrian density, sunlight angles, and vehicle positions, were logged for contextual analysis. The operational approach emphasized accumulation of corroborated evidence rather than immediate confrontation, adhering to established Cold War counterintelligence methodology. By 12 o'clock, federal analysts had constructed a comprehensive operational profile. Repeated micro-excursions, subtle concealment behaviors, peripheral individual coordination, and strategic use of vehicles and environmental cover. Tangible evidence confirmed the presence of intelligence materials, enabling further investigative escalation. Predictive models allowed analysts to anticipate potential future placements or retrievals of sensitive items, guiding subsequent surveillance and intervention strategies. The procedural accumulation of evidence, combined with meticulous observation of micropatterns, provided a basis for federal action. While the groom had not been directly confronted at this stage, the combination of physical evidence, behavioral consistency, and corroborated observer logs validated initial suspicions. This phase marked the transition from civilian observation to structured federal investigation, establishing the framework for continuous surveillance, potential asset identification, and further intelligence analysis. By 12:30, federal units had secured all recovered materials for forensic examination. Observational logs, photographic documentation, and procedural analysis were compiled into a centralized case file. Each action, from initial wedding observation to physical intercepts, was recorded with time-stamped precision. The integration of civilian data with federal surveillance confirmed the operational validity of repeated microactions and environmental correlations, establishing a foundation for the next stage, detailed surveillance, analysis, and interrogation. Following the acquisition of tangible intelligence materials, federal counterintelligence units escalated their operation into a continuous surveillance phase. The groom, confirmed as the operative responsible for repeated hand concealments and dead drop activity, became the primary subject of coordinated observation. Surveillance posts were established at strategic locations along Maple Drive, side alleys, and previously identified drop points. Mobile units patrolled parallel streets at discrete distances, ensuring continuous visual coverage while avoiding detection. Agents employed a combination of fixed observation, mobile tracking, and predictive positioning based on prior micro-pattern recognition. Each unit maintained a detailed log, recording every observed movement with exact timestamps, distances, and environmental conditions. Observation began at 7:45 Eastern Daylight Time, coinciding with the groom's routine excursions. Early surveillance confirmed previously documented patterns. Hedge line pauses lasting between 35 and 65 seconds, brief glances toward peripheral individuals, and subtle adjustments to jacket pockets. The black sedan remained stationed as previously observed, with peripheral vehicles appearing transiently, further suggesting operational signaling. Micropatterns of the groom's behavior were cross-referenced against past documentation, validating predictive models established during prior observation periods. By 8:15, continuous monitoring revealed a consistent operational routine. The groom executed short, repetitive movements, alternating between hedge lines, alleyways, and peripheral zones adjacent to vehicles. Each excursion demonstrated precise control over timing, spatial positioning, and concealment. Observers recorded body orientation, hand gestures, and line-of-sight correlations with peripheral individuals. Subtle variations in pacing, glance direction, and posture were noted for analytical comparison, contributing to a growing dossier of operational behavior. During the mid-morning, federal units identified multiple potential dead drop locations. These included hedgeline gaps, inconspicuous alleyway corners, and near the northern parking lot's peripheral vehicles. Measurements were made, noting distances from building entrances, sight lines from observation posts, and proximity to potential civilian traffic. Each location was considered with respect to operational security, concealment effectiveness, visibility from adjacent areas, and likelihood of incidental detection. Detailed environmental logs were maintained, including sunlight angles, pedestrian movement, and traffic density, to ensure comprehensive documentation for subsequent analysis. By 9 o'clock, analysts had identified peripheral individuals as probable operational collaborators. Their repeated appearances near the groom's excursions, coupled with subtle hand gestures and controlled positioning, suggested functional roles in intelligence tradecraft, possibly as spotters or couriers. Each individual's movement was logged with timestamps, spatial coordinates, and interaction patterns relative to the primary subject. This procedural mapping allowed analysts to anticipate potential operational exchanges and predict future activity with increasing accuracy. At 9:25, the groom approached a previously identified dead drop site near the side alley, executing a hand adjustment lasting 52 seconds. Observers documented hand orientation, concealment technique, and environmental context. Photographic records were captured while maintaining distance and minimizing operational exposure. All handling adhered to strict chain of custody procedures, ensuring evidentiary integrity. The object retrieved was a microfilm container, consistent with prior intelligence patterns. Analysis of its contents was scheduled for secure laboratory review. By 9:45, surveillance extended to include vehicular monitoring. The black sedan and transient gray coupe were mapped in relation to the groom's movements. Observers noted engine idling, door openings, and slight positional adjustments, providing insight into timing cues and potential signal methods. These data points were integrated into the operational dossier, emphasizing correlation rather than interpretation. Micropattern recognition allowed predictive assessment of subsequent activity, enhancing procedural control and risk mitigation for federal units. Between 10 o'clock and 10:30, continuous observation identified a repeated operational cycle. The groom moved between hedgeline concealments and alleyway pauses with remarkable consistency, executing hand adjustments and glances toward peripheral individuals. Each action was precisely timed, durations noted to the nearest second, and line-of-sight alignments cataloged. Environmental conditions, including pedestrian density, vehicle positions, and natural cover, were systematically documented. Observers maintained a detached perspective, ensuring that all data recorded was verifiable and free of conjecture. At 10:45, predictive modeling facilitated a controlled intervention. Agents prepared to intercept an operational exchange without exposing the groom or compromising broader network activity. Surveillance teams coordinated positions along expected movement routes, maintaining visual contact from multiple angles, while ensuring civilian presence did not disrupt the operation. Each unit followed procedural guidelines: discrete positioning, continuous observation, and real-time documentation. The operation emphasized cumulative intelligence collection over immediate confrontation, consistent with Cold War counterintelligence methodology. By 11 o'clock, a controlled intercept was executed. The Groom approached a hedge line gap, paused, and retrieved a microfilm container. Observers documented every gesture, maintaining precise timing and spatial correlation. The object was photographed and removed under strict chain of custody procedures, ensuring that no alteration occurred. Environmental conditions were logged: sunlight angle, shadow coverage, and pedestrian proximity. All actions were recorded to maintain procedural integrity and evidentiary validity. Following the intercept, surveillance continued with enhanced focus on peripheral individuals. Analysts mapped their repeated positioning relative to the Groom's movements, noting brief pauses, hand adjustments, and subtle positional shifts. While direct interaction with the primary subject was not observed, the probability of operational facilitation was high. Each observation was logged, providing critical context for analysis of network structure and communication methods. By 11:30, the operational profile was refined. Analysts integrated micro-pattern recognition, environmental data, and observed physical exchanges into a cohesive intelligence model. Repeated hand adjustments, gaze direction, and peripheral coordination were cross-referenced against prior wedding observation notes, confirming continuity of operational behavior. Predictive analysis allowed federal units to anticipate potential future movements, optimizing positioning for subsequent surveillance and interception. At 12 o'clock, preparatory measures for interrogation were initiated. Federal analysts reviewed recovered materials, including microfilm containers, unmarked envelopes, and associated notes. Each item was cataloged, photographed, and stored under secure conditions. Procedural review emphasized environmental context at the time of retrieval, microgestures, concealment technique, and positioning of peripheral individuals. Analysts maintained a strict focus on objective documentation, ensuring that all evidence collected was verifiable and reproducible for formal proceedings. Between 12:15 and 12:45, the Groom remained under observation as he moved intermittently between hedgeline and alleyway locations. Observers recorded every hand adjustment, microglance, and line-of-sight alignment. Peripheral individuals maintained their positions, offering indirect corroboration of operational coordination. Analysts emphasized documentation of factual observations without inference, maintaining procedural integrity. By 1300 hours, predictive observation allowed a controlled approach for preliminary questioning. Federal agents established discrete checkpoints to facilitate eventual formal interrogation. Timing and positioning were aligned with repeated operational cycles, ensuring minimal exposure and maximal observational control. All activities were logged with exact timestamps, environmental context, and procedural notes. At 13:15, the primary subject was escorted to a secure federal facility under procedural guidelines, avoiding confrontation during transit. Recovered materials accompanied the subject, cataloged with chain of custody documentation. Analysts maintained continuous records of every movement, ensuring that procedural integrity was upheld from field surveillance through physical transfer. Following arrival, the subject underwent preliminary procedural interviews. Federal analysts focused on factual confirmation, movements, recovered materials, and observed behavior patterns. No assumptions regarding motivation were made. All data collected was factual, time-stamped, and corroborated with prior observation. Peripheral individuals' roles remained unconfirmed but were cataloged for further analysis. By 1400 hours, federal units had consolidated all recovered evidence and observational logs into a centralized intelligence dossier. Analysts highlighted the consistency of micropatterns, environmental correlation, and operational concealment techniques. Each entry was time-stamped, spatially referenced, and cross-referenced with previous observations. This procedural approach ensured that subsequent intelligence analysis, including full interrogation and potential network mapping, would be grounded in verifiable fact. The cumulative result of surveillance and initial federal involvement confirmed repeated operational behavior consistent with professional intelligence tradecraft. Precise hand adjustments, line-of-sight awareness, peripheral coordination, and structured environmental engagement all demonstrated deliberate operational planning. These findings validated the observer's initial documentation, bridging civilian observation with federal procedural analysis. By mid-afternoon, the operational focus shifted toward identification and verification of the subject's potential network. Peripheral individuals were monitored continuously, with positional and behavioral data logged for predictive modeling. Analysts noted repeated patterns suggesting indirect facilitation of communication or dead drop retrieval. Environmental mapping, combined with recovered materials, provided a procedural framework for deeper intelligence analysis. Through meticulous documentation, predictive observation, and controlled intercepts, federal units established a comprehensive operational record. The Groom, now identified as a confirmed asset, remained under controlled observation while procedural groundwork was laid for formal interrogation. The systematic approach emphasized empirical data collection, verification, and chain of custody integrity, reflecting the methodological standards of Cold War counterintelligence operations. Following the formal interrogation of the Groom, federal analysts prepared a targeted operation to identify and apprehend the associated handler whose involvement remained partially obscured. Predictive models based on prior surveillance suggested specific movement patterns, potential rendezvous points, and subtle signaling behavior. Surveillance units were redeployed across multiple urban sectors to monitor locations historically associated with intelligence exchanges, including secondary dead drop sites, peripheral vehicle alignments, and low-traffic alleyways. Observers were instructed to maintain discrete positioning while continuously recording time-stamped observations of all persons exhibiting correlation with known patterns. The operation commenced at 7 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time, with mobile and fixed units assigned according to prior predictive mapping. Vehicles matching descriptions from previous surveillance were logged, and environmental conditions, including pedestrian density, weather, and natural cover, were systematically recorded. Analysts focused on identifying minor but consistent cues, repeated glances toward specific streets, hand gestures near coat pockets, and transient pauses near environmental markers. Despite the extensive deployment, the handler remained largely elusive, demonstrating operational discipline consistent with professional counterintelligence training. Between 7:30 and 9 o'clock, multiple surveillance teams reported transient sightings of individuals whose behavior partially matched predictive models. Each sighting was logged with precision: time, approximate location, environmental conditions, and minor microbehaviors such as gestural communication, pacing patterns, and line-of-sight glances. While each instance suggested potential handler involvement, none culminated in a direct observation sufficient for interception. Analysts cross-referenced these observations with prior surveillance logs of the Groom and peripheral individuals, yet consistent identification remained unattainable. By 9:15, cumulative data suggested the handler employed advanced evasion techniques. Patterns indicated careful avoidance of main thoroughfares, intermittent use of public transportation, and reliance on peripheral visual cues to maintain awareness of surveillance units. Observers recorded minor environmental manipulations, shifting position of a coat sleeve to signal, subtle pauses near inconspicuous objects, and micro-adjustments in gait correlated with predicted intelligence tradecraft. Analysts emphasized procedural documentation over assumption, cataloging each microbehavior to construct a probabilistic operational profile. At 10 o'clock, the operation attempted a controlled sting based on repeated patterns and predictive modeling. Agents positioned themselves along anticipated interception points, maintaining visual contact while avoiding detection by civilian populations. Environmental conditions were considered. Shadow angles, sunlight coverage, and pedestrian density were all factored into placement strategy. Despite meticulous planning, the target's movements deviated from expected trajectories. The handler avoided established checkpoints, utilizing rapid directional changes and peripheral routes, thereby nullifying the planned interception. Observers documented each deviation with exact timestamps and environmental annotations. Between 10:30 and 12 o'clock, surveillance continued with emphasis on potential communication attempts with previously observed peripheral individuals. Agents monitored locations where subtle signals could be exchanged, including alleyway corners, vehicular alignments, and discrete urban markers. While multiple micro-behaviors consistent with signaling were recorded, brief glances, hand adjustments, and transient pauses, no direct exchange or contact could be confirmed. Analysts cataloged these anomalies, preserving each data point for subsequent analytical modeling, while acknowledging that operational ambiguity remained high. By 12:30, procedural analysis indicated partial success. Tangible evidence had been recovered from prior intercepts, including microfilm containers and unmarked envelopes directly associated with the Groom. The asset, now in federal custody, provided information confirming operational methods, tradecraft routines, and peripheral coordination. However, despite extensive surveillance and predictive modeling, the handler had not been located. Analysts concluded that the network employed layered operational security, with multiple indirect pathways, temporal misalignment strategies, and environmental exploitation to maintain anonymity. From 13 to 1400 hours, analysts conducted comprehensive review sessions, cross-referencing recovered materials with time-stamped observational logs from both the wedding and post-wedding surveillance. Patterns of concealment, alignment with vehicles, and peripheral facilitation were systematically integrated into a central intelligence dossier. Despite this, the handler's identity remained incomplete. Partial facial descriptions, clothing cues, and microbehavioral tendencies were logged, yet insufficient for direct identification or apprehension. This unresolved element emphasized the enduring ambiguity of Cold War clandestine operations. Between 1415 and 1500 hours, the Groom underwent further procedural debriefing. Analysts documented specific operational sequences, hedgeline pauses, alleyway retrievals, and peripheral coordination. Detailed attention was given to duration, spatial relationships, and microgesture timing. Each point was cross-referenced with predictive modeling to assess potential locations or methods of communication utilized by the handler. Analysts noted that while certain methods were described, practical interception remained unfeasible due to layered operational security and controlled mobility. By 1530, federal operations acknowledged the limited success of the sting. While procedural intelligence had expanded considerably, documenting operational routines, microbehaviors, and physical evidence recovery, the handler had successfully evaded capture. Analysts noted that attempts to replicate the operational environment, including placing agents at predicted dead drop sites, failed to provoke detectable response. Environmental manipulation, timing adjustments, and transient urban movement allowed the handler to remain partially obscured, consistent with Cold War tradecraft designed for compartmentalization and network preservation. Between 1600 hours and 1700 hours, post-operation analysis emphasized long-term intelligence utility rather than immediate operational closure. Recovered materials, combined with observational logs, created a comprehensive profile of asset routines, peripheral coordination, and concealment methods. Analysts prepared a procedural dossier for potential ongoing monitoring, emphasizing predictive modeling of network behavior, identification of potential future dead drop locations, and probabilistic assessment of peripheral individual involvement. Despite the unresolved identity of the handler, actionable intelligence had been codified for future operations. By 1730, the operational conclusion for the day recognized both successes and limitations. The Groom, formally processed and under federal custody, remained a primary source of procedural insight. Tangible evidence, corroborated observation, and pattern recognition confirmed the presence of organized intelligence activity. Peripheral individuals were cataloged, microbehaviors recorded, and environmental context preserved. Yet the central handler, whose operational orchestration remained partially hidden, demonstrated the enduring challenges of Cold War espionage. Between 1800 hours and 1900 hours, analysts reflected on operational gaps, procedural challenges, and network evasion. The inability to apprehend the handler highlighted the layered, compartmentalized nature of clandestine operations, where assets and facilitators maintained operational anonymity through environmental manipulation, temporal precision, and indirect signaling. Each observation, however minor, was preserved for potential future correlation, maintaining the integrity of procedural intelligence. By 1930, formal reports were compiled. The Groom faced legal proceedings, with sentencing contingent upon federal review of recovered materials and procedural corroboration. Peripheral individuals remained under passive monitoring, with continued attention to movement patterns and potential signals. Analysts emphasized that while partial operational success had been achieved, the unresolved status of the handler and associated network components preserved the uncertainty inherent to Cold War intelligence work. As night fell, federal units scaled back active surveillance, maintaining remote monitoring and observational readiness. Analysts noted that environmental conditions, civilian traffic, and urban cover provided continued opportunities for network evasion. While tangible evidence had been secured and the asset contained, the broader operational structure, including the elusive handler, remained intact. Procedural documentation, predictive modeling, and recovered materials ensured that the federal understanding of the network was extensive but not exhaustive. The conclusion of this phase highlighted a fundamental characteristic of Cold War espionage: partial resolution, operational ambiguity, and enduring uncertainty. Tactical successes, intercepted materials, corroborated micropatterns, and verified operational behavior were balanced by the inability to fully identify or capture the handler. Analysts emphasized the layered security measures employed: compartmentalization, environmental exploitation, temporal precision, and indirect signaling. Each contributed to the operational resilience of the clandestine network. Despite limitations, the intelligence operation produced a comprehensive procedural record. Time-stamped observations, recovered physical evidence, and correlated microbehaviors provided actionable insight. Predictive models were refined, environmental mappings preserved, and operational hypotheses confirmed. Yet the handler's continued anonymity underscored the ongoing challenges inherent to counterintelligence work, particularly in the context of Cold War operational methodology, where compartmentalization and strategic evasion were standard practice. By the conclusion of the day, federal analysts recognized that intelligence collection had yielded both concrete results and unresolved threads. The Groom remained a contained asset, peripheral individuals cataloged, and recovered materials analyzed. However, the handler's elusiveness and network compartmentalization preserved the intrinsic uncertainty characteristic of Cold War espionage operations. Procedural vigilance, systematic documentation, and predictive observation remained essential tools for ongoing monitoring and potential future intervention.